Freundlich. I'm an environmental program specialist in Region 2, which is in the New York City office, Bureau of Fisheries. And I'll be speaking on one of our outreach initiatives for how we've been addressing the issue of life release in New York City. So as the Bureau of Fisheries, the two main avenues in which we're engaging with the resource is primarily through our surveying and sampling, as well as our rod and reel fishing programs we put on as part of the iFish New York program. In either capacity, when we are in the field, these are the cast of characters we would expect to encounter. Although what you see up on the screen isn't an exhaustive list of all of the species we have in our New York City waters, this is just the familiar faces that we would normally expect to find. However, occasionally we do run into some surprises. Every now and again we run into some exotics, some non-native species, some invasives, and whenever those do rear their head, there's obviously an element of concern around that. When we do see those pop up, we oftentimes are not there when they are transplanted into our waters, so we don't know how long they've been in there. More often than not, if we're catching individuals, we don't know if they were released with others. And kind of looking at the bigger picture, obviously, we don't know the extent to which these species might be impacting or infringing on native fish populations. So this is something that the Bureau has dealt with for a number of years. It's likely that we'll have to continue to deal with and address this issue going into the future. So one of the first kind of pieces or first questions that we really ask is, how are these species being introduced and kind of why is that something that's happening? So for us, we've done a lot of just internal investigation. It's impossible to really know all the individual motivations behind these releases, but what we have been able to do is actually observe certain patterns. So things like what it is that is typically being released that we see time and time again. Certain exotics do rear their head multiple times year to year. So we're able to see that, as well as see those certain water bodies that do receive a lot of exotic transplants. And then we have a historical record to know kind of what areas are hit more frequently than others. And that's kind of helped inform our understanding for why these species are making our way into our waters. So while the list can be kind of exhaustive, I'm only just going to touch on two, and one of those I'll get into more detail. So one thing we have in the city that's pretty common is we have aquarium releases, sometimes called aquarium dumps or pet releases. And this is basically the idea that sometimes people take on a pet, not knowing the responsibility of that. When it gets to a point where they can no longer care for that, they then think it's best to release it into the wild. For us in New York City, that means that these animals are going to be dumped into our New York City parks, which is where all of our freshwater bodies are. So it's not just fish. The picture on the screen is kind of the best case study we have in New York City for aquarium releases, and that are red-eared sliders. They're very common in the pet trade. They are a non-regulated invasive, and they find their way into our parks and wreak havoc on our fishing programs. But that is a separate talk for a later time. For this talk, I'm going to talk about the other means in which we've come to understand why certain exotics are making their ways into our fresh waters in the city, and that is through something known as life release. So we know life release by a number of different names. We commonly know it as mercy release. We also know it as merit release. And it's basically this ceremonial ritual in which a lot of people will come together and release captive animals into the wild. This is something that originates in and is connected to Buddhist practice. It's important to note that not everyone that observes Buddhism is a practitioner of life release. It's also important just to note that this is something that has extended beyond Buddhism and overlaps with other religions stemming from that region of the world, primarily within Eastern Asia. The practice of life release itself is something that for the people that are acting on it are trying to do something in good intention or good faith. These are people that think that they're acting in a way that is kind and compassionate towards animals destined for a life in captivity, whether that be a pet, or whether that be an animal for sale in a live market that is eventually slated to be consumed. They want to act in that animal's best welfare by releasing it into the environment. Obviously, from an ecological standpoint, this is problematic. When we became aware of this issue in our region, we wanted to really dedicate specific outreach to address it. The thing for us that was most alarming is the scale at which these events can happen. So if we look at the images on the screen, that picture in the top is a sanctioned life release event in Asia. The bottom three images are depictions of the aftermath of a life release event that happened in one of our New York City parks. This was actually in Queens. Parks staff were able to notify us after the fact. And when we see just the amount of empty containers of God knows what was in them, we're talking about multiple different species that are likely non-native. We're also talking about hundreds of individuals potentially. So this is obviously a lot more drastic than someone just dumping their pet turtles into a pond. But when we're talking about hundreds of animals, there's a greater likelihood of those things being able to become established or then infringe on native populations. So we wanted to dedicate a specific outreach effort to that, and that really started with the creation of this document. So this is a document that talks about potential alternatives to life release. We put in a lot of work to create this. This was a multi-agency approach. We were obviously in connection and contact with central office. We were able to also get a well-respected member of the Buddhist community to be in these conversations with us as we developed this flyer. And it basically goes on to say that while there's an understanding that people are acting in good faith when they're performing life release, that the ecological consequences far outweigh that motivation, not only for the environment in which they're releasing these animals into, but the animals themselves, just because they usually have a low chance of being able to flourish once they're dumped into an environment that they're not used to being within. It also goes on to just emphasize the fact that dumping animals anywhere in the state without the proper permitting is illegal, and it also offers some alternatives as well. So it goes on to suggest that there are ways to act in the betterment of animal welfare without doing life release. Things like taking on a vegetarian diet or a vegan lifestyle, releasing the insects you might find in your home as opposed to just squishing them. And one thing that has a lot of precedence already with the Buddhist community is actually collaborating with wildlife rehabilitators. So these people that take in sick and injured wildlife will sometimes have a public event. Sometimes they'll open it to members of the public or just groups in general when that animal has been nursed back to health and is ready to be released into the wild. These are obviously species that are native, so it makes sense for them to be released at that point in those locations. And as I mentioned, there is some precedent with Buddhists being able to collaborate with those rehabbers to have a pseudo life release event of this nature, rather than them going on their own and collecting organisms that might not be native to a system and then releasing them. When we first created this flyer, we had it available in a few different languages just to broaden the scope and make sure we were reaching the appropriate audiences. And I'll get into later how we further developed that, but in the original printing, we had it available in English, traditional Chinese, and Korean. The next step was figuring out how to distribute this information. We didn't want to just post this up in a public space and then hope that the right audience would then find it. We thought it would be more impactful to actually deliver these flyers with a conversation. So what we actually were hoping to achieve was we would have a conversation with people within the community. So what we did was we identified some Buddhist temples as well as some community centers where we would hope to go and deliver these flyers in person. That would be a great opportunity for us just to be able to have a conversation about why we're doing the outreach that we're doing, be able to answer questions in real time that people might have for us, and then hopefully also be able to get some information from these people as well regarding the context of life release within New York City. We did have some success in these visitations and the delivery of the flyers. We were also challenged a bit as well, so we were able to have some conversations with folks, but we did encounter some challenges. For us, just our general weekday schedules didn't align with when some of these facilities were open. So if we went for these in-person visits, a lot of time we tried to call ahead. The phone lines wouldn't work. We would go in person. If they were closed, that was kind of the extent to which we would try to be able to contact or communicate with that specific institution. The other thing that we encountered a lot is an issue regarding the language barrier. So more often than not, the majority of the people we were interacting with spoke traditional Chinese, and we didn't have anyone on our staff versed in traditional Chinese. So when we would go in and try to have these conversations and deliver the flyers, sometimes they would take copies of our flyers to give to their constituents and just kind of hear us out in our initial interaction, but it didn't really get past there. There wasn't a big follow-up to that. And it kind of left us, thinking about what are kind of our next steps, what other directions might we want to potentially pursue to better our chances at having an impact with our outreach. So we did pick up some momentum this summer. We actually had a meeting with the New York City's mayor's office, which was really exciting, just because when we talk about the issue of life release, not a lot of people actually know that it's something that happens, but they actually had experience with it. They've also been collaborating within the community to get people, specifically those practicing life release or those aware about the issue, to think about potential alternatives. We also had a community center presentation, so we had some of our staff go to one of these community centers in Flushing that was interested in having us give a presentation to their constituents. They were able to provide us with a translator, so we were able to get our messaging out to those community members in real time, and then we were able to actually field their questions, which was very helpful. We reprinted the flyer, so that original printing just was in traditional Chinese, Korean, and English. We now have it available in Thai and Nepalese as well to hopefully broaden our reach within the community. And as we've gone through this whole process, we've been in discussion with other regions, central office as well as Kathy McGlynn, who's the Aquatic Invasive Species Specialist for DEC, and just continuing to have these conversations about how can we best approach and tailor our outreach as we kind of proceed forward. And that kind of brings us to this closing and discussion. So just as a general PSA, that life release is something that is happening. It's not something that's often known about, and obviously for us in the city it's a big deal, but it does happen within New York State as a whole. So just worthy to be mindful of that. If you find out that life release is something that's going on, might be worth notifying the proper channels or agencies accordingly. And then, as I said, for us in our outreach thus far, we've had some success, but we're trying to also think of creative ways to reach more people within the community. So thinking about our next steps, we were hoping to do some short form video or maybe do some other social media outreach via like broadband radio to reach those people that we hope to get that message across to. We also, obviously, a big limiting factor for us is the language barriers, so we're hoping to have some internal usage of translation services, so we can actually have someone join us on these visitations and be able to help communicate our messaging to the people in real time so that we can field their questions. And then maybe even looking at partnering with outside agencies or reaching out for input from them as well. That was a step that we took in when we developed the flyer, but that was a number of years ago. And if you just Google life release issues, you'll notice that this is something that's actually happening all over the world. So it's likely that there are other states that have encountered such issues. So we're hoping to get some more information and continue that outreach as such. That is going to bring me basically to the end. Happy to answer any questions. I also have my contact information up there as well. So we're always interested in input as well. If anyone knows any ways that we can better reach, we're open to that. And again, happy to answer questions as well.